This is the final chapter. This is called Goodbye Grandma, and it's quite a long chapter, so I can only record 8 minutes at a time on this, so I'll see how far I go. I might need to do it in 2 different videos. Goodbye Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in, you'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her, and she shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? Bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea? No eggs and bacon? No buttered toast? I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho-ho, she cried. Ha-ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. Now, I've got a picture here, but it's a library book, and somebody's drawn in it, so I'll show it to you, but somebody's scribbled on it. Where's the camera? There's Grandma, and there's the cup, which we know does not have tea in it. No, Grandma, George said, this isn't. Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's, Marvellous. Oh, everything's George's around here, shouted Grandma. George is this and George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other 2 cried. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she had swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. Here she is drinking it. Oh, there she is. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Look at this. trying to get it in there as much in as I can. There's Grandma. And there's, where are we going? Oh, there we go. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. "Call the fire brigade!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police! Man the hose pipes!" "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." I'm going to leave it there, and I'll record the next bit in another little video because I want to see what happens to Grandma.